E te rangatira, the Honourable Stuart Nash, Member of Parliament, tēnā koe. E ngā rangatira, Kirsten Wise, Your Worship, Mayor of Napier, tēnā koe. E ngā rangatira, John Purcell, RSA President, Napier, tēnā koe. E ngā kai whakahere, e ngā reo, tēnā koutou, tātou, kua, hui hui. Mai nei, e tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, katoa. As an Australian serving on exchange with the New Zealand Defence Force, and against the backdrop of our shared history and experiences, it is an honour to be able to speak to you in Napier, New Zealand on Anzac Day. Anzac Day is a time to reflect on the contribution made by past and present service personnel who have displayed great courage, discipline and self-sacrifice in choosing a life of service to their country. Today, we honour the original Anzacs who died in the Gallipoli campaign, which commenced with the Dawn landings on 25 April 1915. We also honour those who followed in their footsteps, who are currently deployed on operations or working overseas. Those who continue to honour the Anzac spirit whilst upholding New Zealand's national interests. As it has for Australia, war and conflict has played a key role in the building of New Zealand's national identity. For over 100 years, strong and dynamic national narratives have been created that illustrate the rich history that underpins the Anzac and the Anzac legend. The 8-month-long Gallipoli campaign began with the landings on 25 April 1915 and ended for New Zealand with the final evacuation on 20 December 1915. It was the baptism of fire for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in the First World War, as it saw the highest percentage of casualties suffered by New Zealand during any campaign in New Zealand's history. Drawing upon the work of Dr. Christopher Pugsley, former Lieutenant Colonel in the New Zealand Army and subsequently a senior lecturer in war studies at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, I reflect upon several moments of the first day of battle before briefly turning to the individual efforts of several key personnel and groups in the months that followed. On 25 April, the Australian contingent of the New Zealand and Australian Division, commanded by Major General Sir Alexander Godley, landed around the headland of Ariburnoo at the northern tip of the yet unnamed beach that is today known as Anzac Cove. Inland, the Australians faced a tangle of ridges and gullies. Turkish opposition was slight, but a change in plan resulted in the first two brigades ashore tasked with securing the southern flank, leaving the northern series of crests only weakly occupied. It was on this axis that Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, later known as Kemal Ataturk, launched his initial counterattacks. These took place mid-morning of 25 April, just as the first elements of the New Zealand Infantry Brigade were wading ashore at Anzac Cove. On hearing the news of the landing, Ataturk moved at the head of one of his regiments to the critical height of Chunuk Bair. At 10:30 a.m, he counterattacked down the ridge, and although outnumbered by the total number of Anzacs now ashore, his counterattack threatened to overrun the Australian line at what was known as the Baby 700 feature. New Zealand was committed from midday to reinforce the Australians on the threatened left flank, with the 16th Waikato Company of the Auckland Battalion, the first New Zealanders to see action. This became the battle for Baby 700, involving in turn elements of the Auckland and Canterbury battalions, supporting the Australians in a seesaw battle for the heights. So critical did the situation seem that by late afternoon, when the Otago Battalion landed, it was used to secure the plateau, later known as Plugs Plateau, above Anzac Cove. Casualties were heavy, particularly among officers and NCOs. Lieutenant Colonel D. McBean Stewart, commanding officer of the Canterbury Battalion, was killed, and in the 16th Waikato Company, all the officers and all but one of the senior NCOs were either killed or wounded. It is estimated that of the 3,100 New Zealanders who landed on Anzac Day, some 600 to 700 became casualties. When the Wellington Battalion, the last New Zealand battalion to come ashore, landed on the 25th, the battle for Baby 700 had been lost. Fragmented groups of Australians and New Zealanders held pockets of ground along Second Ridge, where niches in the ridge offered protection from Turkish fire. The nearest of these to Baby 700 would later be known as Quinn's Post, but on that first night it was held by Major T.H. Dawson of the Auckland Battalion, with a mixed garrison of Australians and New Zealanders. Within this, a handful of machine gunners from the Auckland Battalion held the saddle, later known as the Neck. The heat, general conditions, and lack of replacement clothing saw soldiers reduced to cut-down trousers, vests, and headgear of every description. By necessity, it became a ragtag army, creating the legendary image of the Anzac soldier. Food was limited to the essentials of bully beef, biscuits, tin cheese, and jam. The sheer mass of men within the tiny perimeter, the lack of sanitation, the dead bodies buried everywhere among the living, together with those lying out in no man's land, saw dysentery endemic and sickness widespread. The Anzac Corps looked for a way out. The New Zealand Mounted Rifles began patrolling and reconnoitring the coastal ridges north of Anzac to see if this offered a possible route to the high ground. These were men who readily adapted the skills of scouring the Canterbury high country slopes to the business of war. Scouting parties, personally led by the Boer War veteran, Major P.J. Overton of the Canterbury Mounted Rifles, established that the foothills were lightly guarded and that a night advance onto the heights was possible. An advance up the coastal foothills onto the high ground at Chinook Bear to outflank the Turkish defences and then attack down the ridge, taking Baby 700 from the rear, became the basis of planning for an offensive that would involve a series of attacks at both Anzac and Cape Hills. In May 1915, the New Zealand Infantry Brigade returned from Hills and was placed in reserve on the Wellington terraces below what became known as the Sphinx. In early June, the near success of the Turkish attacks on Quinn's Post and Courtney's Post saw the Infantry Brigade replace the now exhausted 4th Australian Brigade. Conditions in the front line on Second Ridge beggared description. Raids on the Turkish trenches to destroy tunnel entrances simply added to the casualty list and further lowered morale. It was a crisis point in the siege of Anzac, which was resolved by the determination of one man, Lieutenant Colonel William Malone of the Wellington Battalion. Through his efforts, each post was put into a proper state of defence. The front trenches were covered over as a defence against Turkish grenades, and communications trenches connected them with terraces below the crest, where bomb-proof shelters were erected to protect the garrison. An aggressive defensive policy was adopted, with Malone determined to dominate the Turks. 3 jam tin bombs were returned for every Turkish grenade, and Turkish fire was met by intense rifle and machine gun fire. Malone transformed an untenable piece of ground into an impregnable fortress. In no man's land, Lieutenant T.P. Maori Grace of the Wellington Battalion coordinated the efforts of New Zealand and Australian snipers to overcome Turkish ascendancy. The efforts of this team enabled mule supply trains to move unmolested up Monash Gully to replenish the front line. At the same time, a network of mine shafts was dug under Second Ridge to intercept the Turkish tunnels and prevent them from being dug below the Anzac trenches. This was the work of professional miners drawn from the battalions who now used their civilian skills to counter Turkish attempts to tunnel under the Anzac front line. Now it was the Turk who feared occupying the trenches opposite Quinn's Post. This transformation, which was due almost entirely to one man's bloody-mindedness and determination, Lieutenant Colonel Malone, and finally secured the Anzac position at the head of Monash Gully. Malone was made post commander at Quinn's, and the New Zealand battalions were rotated through under his command. There is so much more to this story, including the assaults on Chinook Bear and Lone Pine to mention too, but time is my foe, and so I draw to a conclusion this tale of heroism and sacrifice. But before I do that, it is important to recognise the sacrifices made by this region alone. Without doubt, the Hawke's Bay region made the ultimate sacrifice on so many fronts, whether at Gallipoli or in Europe, whether on land, in the air or the sea. Time dims the memory of ordinary events, but not great events. In a nation's history, great events, whether in peace or war, live in our memories regardless of time. They are deemed great, not necessarily for what they achieved, nor for whether they were victorious, or victories or successes. Rather, great events are distinguished by the quality of the human endeavour they called upon, by the examples they create for ordinary men and women, and by the legends they inspire. So it is with Anzac Day. Nā raiera, ina mana, ina rangatira, tato kua hui hui. Maine e tēnei wā, tēnā koto, tēnā tato katoa, lest we forget.